In the winter of 1908, Glasgow was wrapped in a cold, dense fog that clung to the stone buildings like a shroud. Christmas lights blinked weakly through the mist. But even the festive glow couldn't warm the atmosphere on West Princess Street, where an elderly woman named Marian Gilchrist lived alone. Her house, a tall Victorian building with heavy curtains and dim hallways, reflected her personality: careful, private, cautious to the point of paranoia. She was 82 years old, wealthy, and protective of her possessions. Over decades, she had accumulated jewelry, antiques, and financial documents that she guarded as if they were pieces of herself. Her maid, Helen Lambie, was the only person who regularly entered her life. Marian trusted her routine, trusted her steps, trusted her brief disappearances to run errands. And yet, on the night of December 21st, the fragile structure of Marian's carefully controlled world collapsed. That evening, Helen left the house around 7 o'clock to purchase a newspaper for Miss Gilchrist. It was a simple errand she had done countless times before. The gas lamps outside flickered as she stepped into the cold air, unaware that this would be the last time she would see her employer alive. Only a few minutes after she left, neighbors in the apartment below heard a strange something violent, something out of place. One neighbor, a young woman, heard hurried footsteps on the stairs and glimpsed a man leaving the building. She described him vaguely: a man with a cap, possibly dark-haired, possibly fair. Her memory was uncertain, as most human memories are when shaken by panic. When Helen returned, she found the front door slightly open and the house unusually quiet. She rushed inside, calling Miss Gilchrist's name, and what she saw became one of Scotland's most disturbing crime scenes. Marian was lying on the floor of her sitting room, her skull fractured, her face brutally crushed. The furniture was disordered. A drawer stood open, papers scattered. But expensive jewelry was still neatly arranged on a table. Something terrible had happened, but nothing made any sense. Detectives arrived, but the clues were thin. The intruder had acted quickly and left no fingerprints that police were capable of identifying with the tools of that era. The lack of theft made things even more confusing. If the killer had intended to rob Marian, why leave untouched gold, rings, brooches, and valuable antiques openly displayed? Police searched for signs of forced entry but found none. They speculated that the assailant either knew the schedule of the maid or had been watching the house and waiting for an opportunity. This was not the work of an amateur thief or a random prowler. It seemed purposeful, even practiced. But because the public was demanding answers, detectives rushed for the simplest solution, even if it wasn't the right one. Attention soon turned toward a man named Oscar Joseph Slater. Slater was foreign-born, a German Jewish immigrant who had moved to Britain years earlier. He was well-dressed, cosmopolitan, and had a taste for gambling activities that made him stand out in early 20th century Glasgow. In reality, Slater had never been in trouble for violent crimes, nor had he ever met Marian Gilchrist. But newspapers painted him as suspicious because he did not blend into the predictable social mold the public was used to. When the police learned that Slater had pawned a brooch weeks earlier, brooch that vaguely resembled one of Marian, they thought they had found the missing link. No one verified whether Gilchrist's brooch was actually missing until much later, when her family discovered it still safe in her home. Yet the police ignored this crucial detail. Slater became their target simply because he was an outsider. When detectives approached Slater, he did not hide or run. He cooperated, answered questions, and explained his pawn transaction openly. But shortly afterward, he left Scotland for the United States, a trip he had planned well before the murder. Police, desperate for a suspect, interpreted his departure as a sign of guilt. Within days, newspapers printed sensational headlines claiming the murderer had fled across the Atlantic. A telegram was sent to New York authorities demanding his arrest. Slater was taken into custody aboard the ship and shipped back to Scotland, where he walked into a legal storm engineered by fear, prejudice, and sloppy investigative work. The trial that followed in early 1909 was not a fair search for truth. It was a theatrical performance staged to satisfy public demand for justice. Witnesses who had earlier described the fleeing man inconsistently were encouraged, some might say pressured, to adjust their descriptions to resemble Slater. Some said they recognized him. Others expressed uncertainty. Their testimonies grew strangely more confident as the trial approached its climax. The prosecution argued that Slater's pawned brooch was from Gilchrist's home, even though the design did not match and Marian's own brooch was found later. These contradictions were brushed aside. The courtroom atmosphere was thick with bias. Slater, with his foreign accent and fashionable clothes, became a symbol rather than a man. He represented everything unfamiliar and therefore everything suspicious. Defense lawyers tried to argue logic, but logic had no place in a trial fueled by emotion and national anxiety. Predictably, the jury convicted him. Slater was initially sentenced to death, and newspapers announced that justice had been done. But public protests and the absence of solid evidence forced authorities to reduce the sentence to life imprisonment. Slater was sent to Peterhead Prison, one of the harshest incarceration sites in Scotland. And so began a chapter of his life marked by despair, isolation, and relentless suffering. Prisoners in Peterhead were forced into heavy labor, often breaking rocks in the freezing cold. Cells were cramped and unheated. Slater wrote countless letters insisting on his innocence, but his appeals were either ignored or dismissed. Days turned into years. Hope faded, but he refused to give up entirely. While the public eventually forgot, a few sympathetic voices did not. Among them was a name known to millions around the world: Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. By that time, Doyle was more than just the creator of Sherlock Holmes. He was a respected public figure, a man who believed that justice must be grounded in truth, not convenience. He had championed the innocence of George Edelgia, man wrongly accused of mutilating animals. He had succeeded in exposing flaws in that case. When he learned about Slater's conviction, he sensed something disturbingly familiar. The inconsistencies, the contradictions in eyewitness statements, the lack of motive, the dubious evidence, it was all too suspicious. Doyle obtained transcripts, police notes, and trial summaries. Using the analytical precision that defined his fictional detective, he began to dismantle the case piece by piece. As he studied the details, a different narrative emerged. The murderer had attacked Marion during a narrow window of time, showing knowledge of the maid's habits. The intruder ignored easily accessible jewels and instead went straight to one specific drawer containing papers. Slater had no connection to the victim, no reason to kill her, and no way to predict the maid's movements. Even the supposed evidence of the brooch crumbled under scrutiny. Conan Doyle realized that the entire case against Slater was a house of cards held together by prejudice and the desire for closure. Doyle believed that the public needed to see the truth laid out clearly. In 1912, he wrote and published a book titled The Case of Oscar Slater. It was a powerful document, carefully explaining every flaw in the investigation and trial. The book created shockwaves across Scotland. People began questioning how such a weak case could have led to a lifetime sentence. Meanwhile, Slater continued to suffer in prison, aging prematurely from the harsh conditions. Despite Doyle's efforts, the legal system did not immediately take action. Years passed. The First World War erupted and ended. Governments changed, but Slater remained behind bars, almost forgotten. Then, in an unexpected twist worthy of a detective story, a prison warder risked his career to secretly send Slater documents that exposed additional misconduct in his case. These papers were smuggled out and reached people who could act on them. Combined with the growing public pressure ignited by Conan Doyle, they breathed new life into Slater's appeal efforts. By 1927, nearly 18 years after the wrongful conviction, the case finally reached the Court of Criminal Appeal. The court reviewed the evidence, then the glaring lack of a hand overturned the conviction. Oscar Slater was free. He stepped into the daylight, a middle-aged man, his youth stolen, his future uncertain. He received £6,000 in compensation, a very small sum considering what he had endured. Slater tried to rebuild his life quietly. He married, settled in Ayr, and opened a billiard hall. He rarely spoke about the case, perhaps wishing to leave the darkness behind him. He lived until 1948, dying at the age of 76, without ever receiving a formal apology. To this day, the true identity of Marion Gilchrist's murderer remains unknown. Most historians believe the killer was someone familiar with her routine and possibly connected to disputes within her family or community. The intruder's behavior strongly suggests a search for documents, not valuables. But without modern investigative tools, the truth has slipped into the shadows of history. Arthur Conan Doyle, however, was widely praised for his role in freeing Slater. Newspapers hailed him as a real-life Sherlock Holmes, a man who used logic, persistence, and moral conviction to challenge a flawed system. He saw what others refused to see. He questioned what others accepted blindly. His involvement in the case helped drive changes in how Scottish appeals were handled and highlighted the dangers of relying on unreliable eyewitness testimony. Although he did not solve the murder itself, he solved something even more important. He helped uncover the truth about a man imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. The story of Oscar Slater remains a haunting reminder of how easily justice can be derailed when fear and prejudice overshadow reason. It also demonstrates how powerful it can be when one person refuses to be silent. Conan Doyle did not need Sherlock Holmes's fictional brilliance to save Oscar. He only needed courage, compassion, and the determination to expose the truth. Through his efforts, a man regained his freedom, and the world was reminded that justice requires vigilance, skepticism, and the willingness to stand against the tide. Even today, more than a century later, the case continues to echo as a warning. Truth must always be defended, because the cost of ignoring it can destroy innocent lives.